Okay, good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1224. Aleph Reish Chav Daled. And we're middle of this is going to be a pretty long discussion that I believe goes more than 10 pages. It's going to be another 30 pages probably till we get back to Gan Eden. I know that came across a little interestingly. Till we get back to the topic of Gan Eden. As I mentioned, that's on page, I believe, 1254. We're now in 1224. So another 30 pages, yeah. But so we're in a long discussion, so you can relax and settle in understanding the development and the different levels of emotional maturity, which of course is coming to teach us how we grow in our own life and how we grow in our own avodah and work and service from the Nehi, Chagas, Chabad, the 3 stages, which she's calling Mutva, Murgash, and Muskel. Ibur, Yanike, Meichin are the Hebrew words for it. And we're right now middle of the first and second stage. Mutva being the natural, from birth, genetic, emotional characteristics that each one of us has, which in the early stages is in a state of ibur, like in the state of pregnancy, and also in early stages of a child at birth, it's concealed. We can't see it, not the person themselves and not others. And then comes Murgash, is where it's beginning to be felt. It's not just we're wired that way. And like he said, mutva from the word conceal, like tavu, submerged, but now it's beginning to be revealed. And the Rebbe Rashab explaining that this revelation or growth, development of the emotions goes hand in hand with seichel. As the seichel develops, the emotions develop, because the seichel leads and guides the emotions from when it's first in earlier stages, more immature emotions that are interested in more petty or childish things, I should say, to the point where you begin to appreciate greater things as a person matures. But in addition to that, it's not just what we appreciate, but it's also the very emotions are more refined as the mind guides them. So the emotions don't change. The wiring of the child from the way it was born and conceived will always be the same, but it will change is their expression, their interests, where those emotions are guided toward, what objectives they are seeking, and the level of whether they're more raw and crass or more refined and ethereal. So we learned yesterday more at length that you see that the mind is so effective because besides what he said earlier about that, an animal that's just raw emotions, the mind does not change those emotions. An animal will always remain the same, whereas an adult human being, their interests can be directed by the mind. And even if they have emotions, they can either control them or restrain them or even move to something else. So he went to deeper, he went into further explanation, more than that, so in other words, in addition to the emotions being more revealed, they also become, their interest is in greater things. And I would say there are 3 things to sum it up. One is that the emotions themselves, as they develop, they become more revealed than they were concealed earlier. The difference between mutva and murgash. Number 2, their interests are more mature interests as they grow. And number 3, the very emotions are more refined, as I said, and not as raw. But then when he came to explain the seichel, he gave a long discussion how when you can, that without focus of the mind on something, you're not going to have the same passion and emotional connection to it. To the point that if a person is thinking about something else and distracted, even something that's precious, they won't even notice. And the same is the opposite. Something that's dangerous, they won't notice. He actually gave the example of a lion and of thieves. So in other words, it's not just that the emotions are drawn to something. The mind is critical for the awareness of it. You could have something very valuable, and if you don't use your mind, you won't appreciate it. Or you won't know how dangerous it is. So that was his example of how the mind is such an effective tool. And brought the Rambam, how a person who begins to think about and all the fears that are evoked when a person thinks about the challenges when you go to war, so to the extent that he's not allowed to go to his over on Elisa says, if a person is maschil lachshav lahara bil milchama umavel atzmei, he thinks about and concentrates on all the dangers involved, and he scares himself, he frightens himself. So bottom line is we see that though the Hiserus Hamidus Tivim, though they are natural emotions, yet they're dependent on Seichel and Das to guide them, but also to even stimulate them, because you won't be aware of it without the mind. Okay. And the final part in the paragraph on page 1224 was that this is in general the difference, that this is the difference between when it's driven by the mind, they're going to be more refined emotions. When it's driven by nature itself, which is when a child is younger, they're going to be more crass or raw. And then he concluded this is the difference between the animal soul, the divine soul, and the animal soul. The animal soul is generally TV, is lias TV be'etzem. It's a natural biological force. In other words, it goes by its natural inclinations, and that's why it's raw and crass. The divine soul, he says, is naturally sichli be'etzem. So TV and sichli are the words that he's using. And as such, it's more refined and more ethereal. In the parentheses, as we discussed, I'm not going to go over it again, is that the Nefesh Elikis, we're going to learn more about it in the next page, and the page is going forward. The Nefesh Elikis also goes through stages. It is a stage of katnus, where the midas of the Nefesh Elikis are still natural. They're divine in the sense that their focus is divine, but they're still, in a sense, natural and childish. And there, they can still be held hostage by the Nefesh Abamis, as we said. I won't say the word nes. They'll be drawn to the same raw crassness of the animal soul. And I explained that yesterday, so I'm not going to go over that again. If you need explanation, just go back to the yesterday's recording. Okay. So we're now by the new paragraph on page 1224. And he's going to continue the discussion. But just to keep the focus, just keep in mind the three stages, mutva, murgash, muskel. We're still dealing now with how the emotions begin to develop, and as they continue to develop, and the role of intelligence in this process. So if you were asked the question, the difference between a mature person and an immature person, the difference between, let's say, a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 20-year-old, is there a difference in their emotions or a difference in their seichel? So many would answer, you know what, the emotions are the same, but now the seichel has grown and matured. So the seichel, the intelligence of the person, keeps the emotions at bay. You don't just follow every impulse. You don't just have tantrums. You control yourself. There's a restraint. But according to what we're learning here, it's a little deeper than that. It's the seichel is actually helping the emotions also to become more refined. So on one hand, the emotions don't change. A person who's a chazdan, a kind person, always remains a kind person through their life. The wiring of a person doesn't change, just like the color of their hair or their eyes don't change. Well, here you could say it gets white, but I mean the natural part of the human body doesn't change. Their height or other factors, the shape of their the different genetic elements of their beings. So the same thing with the emotions, but the emotions do get refined and directed toward different objects as one grows. But especially this last point. The first 2 points in the emotions, you can say that the emotions get revealed. Okay, revealed doesn't mean change, just means revealed. It's the same person, but now you know their characteristics. The second point, that the emotions get directed not to childish things, but to more mature interests. Also, you can say it's the same emotion, except instead of playing a game that a child will play, you're reading a book. or you're doing something else that has value. The third point, however, which is that the emotions themselves are not become more refined, more ethereal, and not as raw, that doesn't mean the emotions change. It's still chesed or gvura or the other emotional characteristics he described, but the emotion itself has become a more refined emotion. So that would suggest that the emotion also matures, not just the seichel. And the emotion is exactly, in other words, we're still babies emotionally, but our minds grow. No, your emotions also grow, and they also become more mature. Okay. Vihine, and now, Hagdolas Hamidis,
the emotions grow.
The Hagdolas Hamidis, the growth,
growing, not
the
the
development, and the maturity. You want to ask something?
No, the emotions are not growing. The seichel is growing. That's why the emotions.
Okay, well, I just explained that the emotions also based on what he said here. What can I tell you? They grow in three ways. I just mentioned. They become more revealed. They become more interested in higher things, and they become more refined. So it's called Hagdolas Hamidis, yeah. Because all this we're talking about is Mutfa, Murgash, and Muskel. We're talking all in Midas. Remember, it's Chabad, Chagas, Nehi in the Midas, as we learned in the previous pages. That you have the Midas Tivim, and you have the Midas, the so-called, we call the behavioral emotions, that doesn't have any real vitality. We have emotions as emotional emotions by nature, and we have the emotions as they're infected by seichel. But let me continue now. The Hine, Hagdolas. So I want to see one thing, 1 second. Yeah. The Hine, Hagdolas Hamidish Aidea Seichel. The growth or the maturation and development of the midas, all those words are good. The growth, development, maturity or maturation of the midas, idea seichel, that's happening through the seichel, the mind, as we just discussed in the previous paragraph. Hu gam kein bebchinas murgash. Hu gam kein bebchinas murgash. It's still not the level of muskel. Mudva murgash muskel. It's still the level of murgash. The second level that we're talking about, it's chagas or unika, as we're going to learn in a moment more at length. So it's felt and revealed, but it's not yet the level. But it's the murgish, is that which is felt or sensed in the emotional world due to the seichel. V'nase ache yemei hayenika. And it develops into what it is after the Yemei Ayinika, the days or the time, the period of nursing. Remember, the nursing began the process of revealing and growing those emotions. He said tainug, the pleasure, back on, that was on page 1223, the previous page. But after the Yemei Yanika, you still have the level of Murgash, because the emotions are developing as we speak. They're constantly developing. So he says, so that is still the level of Murgash. However, it's a Murgash that is driven and connected with Seichel. That's what he's saying here. But it's not pure Seichel on its own. It's still the level of Murgash. And he's going to explain the Hine, because now, Hagdolas Hamidish Shebemeshech Yimei Yanika, the growth of the emotions, the emotional personality, the emotional character of the child during the period of nursing, Zeh b'chinas Murgash Shebemidus. That is the level of Murgash Shebemidus in contrast to Mutva. Mutva, we said, was the actual wiring that can be concealed. Murgash, however, is becoming to be revealed. So he says the Murgash Shebemidus, the Hainu Shamidus, Hein Bizgalus, Chulu Kanal. That means the Midas, the child's emotions are becoming obvious. Is still a child, but there's something to talk about. You see, an emotional personality is beginning to develop. V'zeh nase, he says in the parentheses, gam kein al-yedei seichel diyanika. Okay, 1 second. This parentheses is not so short. Let me just see. V'zeh nase gam kein. Where's the parentheses end? Oh, it ends 3 lines from the bottom of the page. So let me just see something before I read the parentheses. Okay. Before I read the parentheses, let me just elaborate a bit to make it a little easier to understand. You can say, 1 second, a child that's nursing, whether it's, we're not talking about the nursing literally as a newborn, but let's say within the first 1 or 2 years, a child that may be nursing. And nursing here obviously doesn't mean physically, only the physical nursing. It means the early stages of a child beginning to be fed and sustained. And that causes the child to grow physically and physiologically and emotionally as well. So you're going to see at the end of the page, the next page, he's going to talk more about it. But children, even young children, as opposed to literally a newborn, have something begins to express itself. It's still in a very conscious level, but you cannot say it's completely invisible, that there is something there. So he's going to be discussing now is a very interesting study, psychological study that you don't have that much today. There's more studies on this topic, the early stages of the child's mind development and emotional development. So in very general terms, you can say, yes, a child is not capable of a 1 or 2 year old to having a deep philosophical discussion and understanding of things. But to say the child doesn't have a mind is also incorrect. We just don't see a lot of its expression, but the child's mind, whatever that mind will be like when the child becomes an adult, began when the child was born. The mind doesn't enter our lives in the middle of our teen years, like anything. Just like the fingers or the hand of a child are very small, when the child develops fully, it's the same hand, except now it's a large hand. And the same thing with the mind. The mind at this stage is beginning its early development. So the way Kabbalah Chassidus call it, it's a level called Murgash, because you can't really call it seichel on its own, because it's not abstract thinking, where the mind is a full-forced entity. But to say the mind isn't developing, it absolutely is. The child is learning all the time. Even as a child is watching its parents move their lips, speak. So yes, it may take a year, 2 years, till the child can speak, but they're beginning to learn it immediately. You know, I once saw a physical therapist working with a Down syndrome child. So because they're Down syndrome, their muscles are not fully developed. So in order to help them as they get older to be able to speak better, so they start very early today, early intervention, because that's when you really can have an impact. And it was almost miraculous. You would think a 3 or 4 month old child in a crib would not respond physically to anything. They may smile to you, and you can make them giggle or look at, let's say, a light or a toy moving, but you don't think that they would physically respond. And I saw how the therapist is moving her lips again and again, and I was wondering, why are you moving your lips? She says, watch. Within around 10 minutes, or maybe even less, the child began moving her lips, copying the therapist. I went to little research. This was not known in the past. No one knew that would happen. You thought children, they definitely see things and they're impressionable, but that they can actually mimic something at that early age, we discovered. And by moving the lips, the child moving the lips, it exercises their muscles and helps them develop better skills as they grow older and to face the challenges that they have to face, God forbid. No one should know of it. But you see from that, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination, that a child's mind is working very fertile, and many today say, as Chassidus says, that the mind then is frankly learning more than when we learn when we're 20 years old. 20 years old, we're more conscious, and we can express it, and we're articulate. But those early stages of child development is when the child learns some of its most important skills and tools and different things. It's not, again, intellectual aptitude as in how do you solve a problem, or 2 + 2 is 4, or a mathematical equation, or complex theoretical physics, but the mind is developing. And we're going to get now an insight from Chassidus, based on Kabbalah and based on Torah, of course. I mean, this is Torah, but based on verses and halachas and Kabbalistic insight into the human psyche, the way God created us, of what is actually happening in those early stages. So that's what he's going to be discussing now, more in detail. The parentheses is vital in that component, but the main focus here is that we're talking now a stage where, on one hand, the seichel is beginning to work, and in some ways, therefore, informing and helping the emotions develop and grow, but it's still not a seichel level. It's still called Murgash, he said. Now, you could ask the question, and I think the parenthesis is going to answer it. Does this mean that the human intelligence is actually training the emotions? Or does it mean that the mind, because it's the central nervous system and everything originates from there, so if an emotion is going to be expressed, it's just like without the mind, without the brain and the central nervous system, the child won't move its leg either. All the nerves are getting instructions from the mind. So the emotions as well. Or does it actually mean that there's some intelligent process here? And I don't have a conclusion to this question. I don't have a full answer to this question. I think we'll find out now as we learn, but let's just keep in mind, because earlier we spoke about seichel, which of course is a more mature seichel. Clearly, when you contemplate and say something is precious, and you say something, here's something precious, the mind directs the emotion. Oh, wow, this is so valuable. I'm attracted to it. With a child of this age, you can't yet speak that way. You can't say, you know what, let me explain to the child that they should understand that they shouldn't put their hand in fire, or they shouldn't cross the street. A child is not yet ready for that. So at this stage, the question is the mind also training the emotion on a more subtler and maybe simpler level? Or is it the central nervous system of the mind? So we'll see where he's going with this. I don't want to jump the gun, just pointing out that he's discussing now this stage of the beginning of the emergence of development in the youngest of age. Now, one of the complicated things, of course, from a clinical point of view, is you can't interview a child. You know, you can't sit down and say, okay, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? So it has to come with a lot of speculation and a lot of observation. You observe children and you test it. Like I said before, we now know that children, even at the youngest age, can mimic movements and other things. And we also know that you smile to a child, they smile back at a certain age. No one has figured out why. Well, how do they know to smile? You know, how do they know that? And because clearly there is an awareness and a consciousness. So there's a lot of in the secular scientific and psychological world, there's a lot of experimentation, which hand in hand with what Chassidus says could probably develop into a very eloquent and powerful model of how a child develops. So I would say anyone learning this can use this definitely to have a deeper understanding of child psychology and the child's intellectual and emotional development. But let's learn inside, because so far we've spoken about the emotions and the seichel, but now he's going to go a little deeper into it, how exactly it works. So there's two things here. He's starting the parenthesis. Before the parentheses, the point is Hagdol Samidus Shabemeshach Yimenik Zebchinis Murgash Shabemidus Hainu Shamudus Hem Bizgalus. That the midas are Hem Bizgalus are revealed, relatively speaking, to the lack of revelation by mutva when the child was born, or like you said before, in pregnancy. You don't see anything at that point. But as the child begins to develop, you do see. In the parentheses, he's now going to address the seichel aspect in it. But at the end of the parentheses, he's going to say, and I'm just going to read, because I want to make sure we keep the flow here. I'm just reading 3 lines from the bottom of the page. And then I'm going to go back to the parentheses in a moment. The Inyan hamurgir b'zeh, shamidus hen al pi hakoros haseichel. He's adding now the word hakoros haseichel. What is the Murgash in this level? We're saying it's not purely mutva, the way we're wired and it's concealed. We're saying it's Murgash, it's felt. He says, is the midas according to the recognition, hakaras haseichel, shemake b'sichel shetzorich lirtzes kach kach. The seichel is beginning to recognize that this child should want this or that, so and so. And as a result, the emotions are therefore being impacted somewhat by the seichel's recognition of things. So in other words, the child in its early development, whether a boy or girl, is beginning to recognize certain things that are valuable. Like, you see when a child starts recognizing its first time a bottle, you're giving it a bottle of milk or another food or something else, children begin to recognize. And then they begin to expect, and their emotions react accordingly. Like you'll see, for example, show a child a bottle or say Baba or something, and the child will reach out to grab it. I mean, it all depends, again, the age and so on. But we're talking about those early stages. You do see seichel recognition, where the child will see something, the mind will tell the child, react, and the child will react. Now, this obviously is not mature emotions exactly, or mature seichel, but you can't call this that it's all concealed. It's a very clear process of seichel and midah speaking to each other on a very basic level. So I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to go now back to the parentheses. Just wanted to keep the flow. The parenthesis is going to go more into how the seichel speaks to the midas. That's what it looks like here. So keep in mind, again, the three expressions, ibur, yenika, and moichin, or mudva, murgash, muskel. So he's going to use these language now because there's a thing called moichin de yenika, there's moichin de ibur, and there's moichin de muskel, what is that? Ibur, yenika, and moichin de moichin. So even though we say ibur and yenika and moichin, but there's moichin on all levels. Just like we say there's moichin in the midas level. Like mudva, murgash, muskel, there's seichel in each level. In the first level, you don't see anything revealed. In the second level, the seichel is beginning to communicate with the midas. Now, what's also fascinating here is that we don't have to wait till we turn into adults to start seeing the seichel midas relationship. It begins early on, very early on. There's a point we don't necessarily recognize it or see it, but there's a point we do, like I just elaborated. So I'm going back to the parentheses now. Now, if you do have questions that are coming, I would suggest write them down, and I'll be happy to address it after I finish, because I don't want the questions to disturb the flow here, and they may even be answered in what we're going to learn now. Okay, it says like this now. I'm starting the parentheses on line 3 of the paragraph Vihine on page 1224. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Okay. So the midas that are being felt and sensed in Yimei Yenika, which is the period of nursing, it's just essentially a stage of where a child is beginning to grow in its early development stages. We'll say the first few years. He doesn't give it a exact span of time, but generally Yenika, if I recall correctly, is at least 3 or 4 years. Now, not most children don't nurse for 3 or 4 years. We know that.
Yenika is 2 years. 2 years. 24 חודש.
I'm sorry?
24 חודשים. ויגדל הילד ויגומר. He stopped to yenik.
Yes, but in some places it says it's a few more years. I think in Eitz Chaim, he may discuss it a little later. But for argument's sake, let's say it's 2 years, 24 months. Okay. V'zeh nasa, she says this development of emotion, nasa gam kain, idea seichel di yenika. So you see now the word seichel of yenika. In other words, in the stage of yenika, of nursing, the development of the emotions are not just happening on their own. Because you could say, you know what? Just like the arms and legs and the head and the other parts of the body of the child are developing, the emotions also develop. He says it's also through seichel. But seichel of yenika.
I think al yedei
okay. Do me a favor. One second.
The yenika
Rab Shlomo, I'm asking you to cooperate. There are many people in this class. There are many people who listen to the recording. I hear time and again they feel they're losing focus. So I have asked many times, let me teach it. Write down any thoughts you have. Be happy to listen to anything anyone has to say. Or else we're going to have two people speaking, you and I, and people will be confused. So if you don't mind, let's exercise some discipline. And I'm happy to hear any thoughts, not censoring, but just let's do it in the right timing. So I'm going to explain, I'm going to learn this inside, and then you and anyone else can weigh in, questions, comments, and so on. If I was learning one-on-one with you, it wouldn't be an issue, but we're not. That's the thing. So he says like this, V'zen nasa gam ke adei haseichel di'anika. Actually, no, I should read it a little differently. V'zen nasa gam ke adei haseichel.
That's what I said.
Di'anika, okay, but there's one teacher here. And if I have to, I mean, you have to trust that I know how to read. So if I don't read it the first time right, I'll get it.
Apologize.
This too happens through seichel. Now, I read a seichel dianika because I know there's a level called seichel dianika, but the reading here is dianika, which is the second level, not ibur. Yanika, who beginnest meichin keneda. The gam hagdola hanal, and also the growth that we mentioned before. Sha'achar hayanika, who gam came ha'meichen dianika. So you see, he uses now meichen dianika. So, like he said, remember in the beginning, line 2, he said, "Hagdolas hamidas shemeshi meinu zebchinis murgash midah." So he said, in the line 2, he said before that, "Hamurgash shemetzad haseichel v'nasa acher yemei hayanika." In other words, as we learned before, as a person grows, as their seichel grows, their emotions are impacted by that. So what he's saying now is that during Yemei Yanika, during those early stages, it also is coming through seichel, meaning through moichin. And also the growth that happens after Yanika is also from moichin dianika, because still not full moichin, because it's still, let's say, after 2 years old, or 3 years old, or 4 years old. Let's say 7 years old. So 7 years old, you still can't call it the level of moichin mamish. It's still moichin dianika. So basically, to put it in different words, once you you move from the stage of mutva or ibur, where midas are not yet obvious, and you move now that they're starting to become revealed, there are stages, many stages. They're all being driven by moichin dianika. That the moichin of yanika is driving the stage of yanika, the growth that happens during the nursing stage, and also the growth that happens afterwards. It will only be later in life. We're going to learn after bar mitzvah, or when moichin begins to really develop as an independent force, that the moichin will be independent of emotions. But right now, we're talking about emotions as they're developing together with the moichin, but it's not moichin in its full-blown sense. It's moichin of yanika, seichel, that is affecting the emotions and their growth. That's what he's saying here. So the parenthesis is vital because he wants us to know that it's not like after yanika, you're moving to the level of moichin. You're still in moichin di yanika. You're still basically in, if you want to put it in different words, Chabad within Chagas. It's not, so it's still Chabad Chagas in the lowest level. The truth is all of this is within Midas, but it's not Chabad in its full force. It's all within the level of Yanika, which is the level of the recognition and the revelation of emotions. Like we see by a child in the stage of nursing stage. So again, yes, nursing doesn't mean necessarily technically nursing. In Halacha and Gemara, Yemei Yanika means the early childhood stage. You see, a child has some intelligent recognition. Like I mentioned before, you can see recognition. It may not be the recognition of an adult, but it's recognition. The child can recognize its mother, it can recognize objects, recognizes sounds, smells, we know. So there is some intelligent recognition. Rak shahagdola b'shebimei hu agdolas hachemes sheberuchnis. So then, what does the growth consist of? Remember, we said raw emotions, just emotion emotion itself is raw and unshaped yet, meaning it's still crass. So he says the Agdola should be a Ayin. What is the growth in that stage, the early development stage of a child? Who Agdolas hachemer sheberuchnis is the growth of the chemer, which means we'll call it the crass part or the raw part of ruchnis liasmuchen lekabel tzura. I'm going to explain what it means in a moment. To be able to receive a tzura. Okay, so let me first explain it with a simple example, and then we'll explain it how it means on an emotional level. When you, let's say, take a raw piece of clay or any other material, and you want to shape it into a beautiful pot or a beautiful goblet or some object, some usable object. So there are several stages. The first stage is that you need to soften it up. You need to soften it up so it should be able to then be shaped into details. So if you'll see any good sculptor, they don't just sculpt the image immediately. They first work with it. And slowly, they make it the state that first you see a general structure, and then they start going into the fine details. Same thing, for example, when an artist, but I'm using specifically sculptor or pottery or taking clay and shaping it into a pot, because there are stages. So when you want something to become more refined and a more, what we're calling here, chemer and surah. So chemer is the raw material, surah is the shape you make in it. But before it's ready to be able to adapt to a shape, you have to do something to soften it up, so to speak. So what he's saying, the same is with midas and seichel. Seichel is essentially, we said before, the meir derech. It's the force that will direct and guide all of the human being, but especially the emotions. But it takes stages, many stages. The full ultimate stage is when the seichel is full maturity. But even in the early stages, it's the child's intelligence that's taking the very raw emotions, the pure impulses, and giving them some shape and form and direction. So what he says is that the growth consists of the growth of the chemer sheberuchnis. It's not the ruchnis sheberuchnis, it's the chemer sheberuchnis, meaning here ruchnis, he means the more ethereal stage. So you're taking the chemer of the ruchnis and making it ready to be mekabel the tzura that you wanted to have. And he's going to explain now what this means specifically. The mutva levad, because the level of mutva, the natural wiring of the emotions alone, she'ena midas nikarim klal, a stage where the midas, the emotions are not recognizable at all. You don't see any emotional reaction yet. The aim behem gili haseichel klal, and they don't have any gili haseichel. So if you talk about a pure newborn, or we'll talk about the stage of ibur, even pregnancy, the later stages of pregnancy. So the midas are not nikr yet, and there's no gili haseichel klal. Ein kan shum hachana klal lekabbalas hatzura. So, for example, what I said before, that the therapist was moving its lips, her lips, for the child to respond to, you can't expect that from a child in pregnancy, or even from a very newborn as soon as it's born. When he said earlier, if you remember, I just want to go back to the lashon that he used. Where is the expression? Oh, here. Where he compared pregnancy to a newborn. Just give me a second. Yeah, the bottom of page 1222. I think it's important to emphasize. A child, as soon as he's born, you can't yet see the child's any of its characteristics. Just as during pregnancy, the child already has developed the midas. So miyad shenelad yeshna b'rakshim b'tachlis hakatnus v'helam. They're not at all recognizable or felt, not by him and not by others. Okay, concealed, tovu. So he's focusing. So at the level of mutva, you don't have anything yet. You can't, for example, start training a child, a newborn, literally a newborn, or definitely not a child in pregnancy, to because its seichel is not functioning yet. It's functioning internally, and of course, keeping the child alive. So there's a mind, but a mind that is impressionable in some way, you don't really have yet. Now, I have a question on this because we know today, even a newborn, literally, even the first second, also is impressed by what's happening around it. So I have to say that he means here in a revealed way that yes, if you do something with a newborn, immediately, that's why you give the newborn to a mother, because there's a certain connection and attachment that is necessary for the child's development. It's correct, it's having an impact, but you can't see it. That's what he's talking about here. So he's not saying there's nothing happening, but it's not visible yet. Whereas a little later stage, you can see a visible mind working, at least in recognizing things, and the emotions that go along with it. So that's what he's saying. That's what I believe you have to say means the pshat. Because when he says, you could say, 1 minute. Right now, you don't see it. But of course it's already being impressed by some surah. But so that's why I'm explaining that you have to say it means it's not recognizable at all yet. So in shum hachana klal kabbalah satsura, I mean it's not lie. It doesn't lie in the actual word. The word sounds like that it's so raw that it can't assume any. It's not even a keli who says in shum hachana. There's no preparation kabbalah satsura. So I think he means by hachana he means in a more recognizable or visible way. Ubiyimei ha'ibur. Not Yemei Yenika. In Yemei Ibur, in that stage of Ibur, which actually now I don't even need to force it, because if he's talking about Ibur in pregnancy, for sure that's the case. Even though it's true that we know today that if something happens that traumatizes a mother during pregnancy, it can have an impact on the child. But you can't see it at that stage. There's nothing there to express it. In other words, the child does not yet have expressive faculties. The personality of the child has been shaped. And that's correct, like we said, but it's still all concealed. So he's saying, Ibur, it's only the very body that's growing in a visible way. The emotions, you don't see any visible growth because it's all concealed. Ayinika, on the other hand, in the nursing stage, stage 2, which is the early development stage, that hu hagdolas haruchnius v'hainu hamidus. So he's defining haruchnius as being something of the faculties. You see not just the chaymer. So ruchni is referring to the faculties in contrast to the body. Up till that stage, you see the body's growth. In the early stages of Yanika, which is the early stages of development of the child after birth, you see also that Gdolas HaRuchni says clearly, V'hainu hamidus. However, the midas are still in the raw form, like we said. But now they're ready, they're now in a form that they can receive and start being shaped by the seichel. Like he's going to say, Rak shezeu, rak is galos hamidus. So that first stage is just, now the midas have been revealed. Sha'ikir, hu rak mitzad hatva levad. Okay, so he's clearly dividing it into 2 stages. One is Ibur where you don't see any emotions at all, and all you see is body, the body growth. Now you talk about Yemei Yanika in the beginning. You have the emotions are beginning to develop and revealed, but you're only seeing the midas. And their primary thing is their natural impulses. So how is that? That's what he's calling the chaymer within the emotions. In other words, the emotions in their raw form. And that's just a primer or a preparation, the Kabbalah's tzuras haseichel. Okay, so now going back to the words, chaymer is here body. Midas is the ruchnias, but the midas alone is the chaymer sheberuchnias, and the tzura, that's seichel. Seichel begins to give it shape. So the midas on themselves is like the raw clay that I spoke about before, but it can be concealed or it can be revealed, and then it becomes a stage where it becomes, like he says, that is and now it's ready to receive the tzuras haseichel. The haseichel ikar hatzura, because the seichel is the primary place that begins to give shape and direction to the midas. The bederach klal midas ein b'chinas chaymer, because in general the midas are in a state of a raw, crass state, as we learned earlier. V'haseichel b'chinas tzura. Seichel gives things more shape and form and direction, and also becomes more ethereal and more refined. And that's because, like we learned in the previous paragraph, midas is the very natural wiring of the nefesh. So it's raw material, basically. It's the raw characteristics of the genetic structure of the person. And we learned earlier the tivi hu chumri, that tivi, anything that's just pure natural, is raw and crass. Vasichli hu ruchni, and the sichli is already ethereal and more refined. Shezeu tzuras hanefesh. So that's called the tzura. So the chaymer in this case would be chaymer, literally chaymer shebechaymer is body. Chaymer shebetzura, chaymer sheberuchni is midas, and the tzura is the seichel, which is tzuras hanefesh. Valkain, and therefore, during that stage, this second stage of the nursing stage, is galus midas, where the primary thing now is the midas are emerging and being revealed. Even though it has some seichel, like he said in the beginning of the parentheses, there the primary thing, it's only the growth of the chaymer, which is the midas within the ruchnius of the spirit. So ruchnius would be, yes, ruchnius I know midas. What is the chaymer of the midas? The chaymer of the ruchnius. Murgash shebemidas. This is the level of murgash, not mutva, because mutva is still all concealed. Now and only the body is growing. Now the midas are being revealed, so there's midas. Shehu achana, and that becomes a preparation lekabel tzuras haseichel shezeu la'achar hayanika. So the main place where it begins to receive seichel is after yanika, after the first stages of development. Even though yanika also has, like he said it clearly, it's also mitzad haseichel, right? Ksa seichel he calls it, a little seichel. Shezeu la'achar hayanika hu b'chinas murgash mitzad haseichel. Okay, and that's the Murgash mitzad haseichel. So basically, he's broken Murgash into two stages now. There's mutva, is the natural characteristics concealed, ibur. There, it's pure chaymer. The only thing you see that grows is the body. The beginning of the stages of yanika, when a child is already born, and in the nursing stages, is the first lower level of Murgash mitzad midas. So the midas are beginning to emerge. You see a child feeling things, attracted to things, and so on. There's always a little seichel, because even in that stage of yanika, there's also seichel called moichin di yanika. There's some moichin that's giving it some direction, but it's not in the full sense of it. Then comes stage 2 in Murgash, not in Meich. In Murgash, what he calls Murgash mitzad ha-seichel, not mitzad ha-midas. And now it's getting the tzura that seichel begins to give it, which is, of course, the stage when a child begins to speak, and the next stage of its intelligent and its emotional development. So in Murgash itself, we have 2 levels here very clearly. Both, one has ksas seichel, one has more seichel, but it's all still the level of midas. One is the midas in their raw form, and there's one of the midas where the midas are starting to get shaped and directed by the seichel, and that's primarily after acher hayanika, after the stage of nursing. In other words, if it's 24 months or whatever it is, the next stage. So this is all still Murgash, but it's the seichel sheba Murgash or the midas sheba Murgash. Okay. That's the explanation in the parentheses. I will stop now. If anybody wants to ask anything or get more clarity, please.
More clarity about the.
One second, listen. In the name of discipline, let's see if anybody else wants to ask anything, and I'll go to you afterwards. How's that?
Simon, it was a gehalten for a long time. Now, why are you not allowing me to ask?
We're going to send you an award. Go ahead. I just want to respect everybody. That's my point.
You are. I'm also part of the everybody. The ego that you said before, I know what you said, that there is also something there in the ego because we know that. But it's not called because it's not the his galus cloud, right? But there is, you cannot say it's mudba only choimer with nothing else. I'm asking.
Well, that's why I read. Did you read? Go back to read the bottom of page 1222. He spells it out very explicitly there.
Okay.
He says clearly, Einim Nikodim, Klal. That's all. It's Einim Nikodim. Even though he says clearly, he says like this, these words. One second. Shari Gam Oz Nibur. Kfa Yeshba Hamidus, Hari Einim Nikodim Klal. Absolutely.
Okay.
He didn't say they don't exist. Look, the fact is a child in the last stages of pregnancy has a mind, a brain, has emotions. Everything is there. It's just not active in any revealed way. That's the main thing. The truth is you could ask a question. We know today that a child reacts even in pregnancy. If you play song or music, the child will react. But what he clearly means here is in any real, like, in an ongoing, consistent way. Like once a child is already 1 year old or 6 months old, you see an ongoing, revealed human being functioning. In pregnancy,
I have a story about that.
In pregnancy, the child is alive and all the faculties are there, but they're not in any functional way. For sure in pregnancy, even newborn, but that's what he says. But go ahead, let Rabbi Shlomo finish. That's what you wanted to clarify?
Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
As it was a mother, she's a teacher. She used to sing a certain song with the class while she was pregnant. And they asked the child later, what's your favorite song? And it was that same tune that she used to sing during pregnancy.
Beautiful. Yeah, that for sure. It's not a contradiction to this at all. Because we didn't say, as I said before, the child, we know today, God forbid, if a mother suffers trauma, or in this case, beautiful song, it makes an impression in the child's psyche, but it's not obvious yet. That's the thing.
I have a question. I'm sorry, Rabbi Weingart.
Yeah,
Rabbi
just
Weingart.
I just want to finish something.
Go ahead.
L'chera, you can sum this up in like one sentence, that seichel gives midas an expression. Without seichel, midas can't grow and they can't express itself. So the more sophisticated the seichel is, the more sophisticated and bigger the emotions are.
The reason I wouldn't say those words is because if, for example, with animals where the seichel is not controlling the emotions, emotions have an expression. If an animal is hungry, a predator is going to be very expressive in its hunger and is going to pursue a prey. So to say there's no expression without seichel, I don't know if you could say that. You could say there's no
Animals have a brain too.
Yeah, but that's not. But we learned before that he gave proof in the last page that animals, their seichel is not shaping their emotions. The emotions don't change. So to say that a raw emotion, if somebody right now has a passionate desire for something that's really inappropriate, and the seichel absolutely would never agree, it's dangerous. You can't say the emotion does not have any impulsive shape and form. So I wouldn't use the word shape and form. I would say
There, the seichel is serving the emotion. What a person has to do is make sure the emotion serve his seichel.
No, but I'm saying to say that a midah without seichel does not have any shape and form, I don't know if that you could say that. You could say it's raw, like he said, and not directed, not seasoned, not refined. But he did say seichel is a meira derech. It gives direction to the midas. Correct. But you could imagine a scenario where emotions, like he says, mutva, right? The stage of mutva is there. The emotions are there. There's ktsas seichel. Anyway, I don't know if we're disagreeing here. Just it's semantics, perhaps it's words, but it is true. The seichel does give tsura, but tsura means also an ethereal part, a refined part of it.
I have a question.
Just one second.
Okay, all right. Yeshkach.
I'm just thinking, if a child, for example, just emotionally in its an emotional inquisitiveness and curiosity, sticks its finger inside, let's say, God forbid, an outlet and gets a shock, right? So I can't say there's no seichel involved there, because the seichel is always involved. It was the curiosity of the mind that saw the outlet, and the emotions went after that. So there's definitely a seichel that's guiding it, because so you could say in that sense that if you took away seichel completely, would the emotion have any reaction? That's an interesting question. I have to think about it. Based on what he's saying here, it sounds like that as soon as emotions begin to develop, there has to be some seichel. And seichel doesn't mean intelligence. It has to be some awareness, something, or perhaps not. Like we know, when a child is nursing, it just naturally knows to suckle and nurse. It doesn't need any intelligence. It's a impulsive behavior, just like a child moves around all the time. It's not like this, so we need to develop. That's why I asked the question at the outset: is the seichel like the central nervous system, or is the seichel some form of cognitive experience? I have to think about it some more. It sounds to me that there's something cognitive, but very, very minimal, and that then fully develops further as the child grows, and we go from Yanika, from the Murgash of Bimidus to the Murgash of Seichel. That's what it sounds like to me. But it's an interesting question to know what exactly on the cognitive level. I have to read it again and think about it, but I will. I'll get back to I don't know if that's what you were covering, but that is definitely interesting to know exactly the role of it. May become clear also as we learn further. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
The way I understand it, it plays two roles. One, it gives it words for expression, and perhaps like a plant, it helps it grow. Water to a plant, it helps the plant grow.
But what do you mean by expression? It gives it words. It doesn't need words. You mean
the emotion? You need with what to express your emotion. If you like something, yeah. when you have more words to express how you like it, that helps the emotion grow.
Well, we're talking here a stage before there's words and speech. So you don't mean words,
Yeah.
literal.
There's words. There's also words of thought.
Well, look, when a baby sees a bottle, it will be drawn to it. So the emotions are following.
Let's the memory of the good taste of the last bottle helps it have an emotion towards the bottle. Though that's words.
Okay,
it's
fine.
Not conscious words, but
I agree. That's correct. Okay.
Okay. All right. I guess we'll move on for the next person.
Please.
So I have a question about like the whole past 2 or 3 pages that I've been wondering. So he's laying out a very elaborate, detailed scheme of human development and the development of the emotional system and the intellectual system, and how much the cognitive affects the emotional primarily is one of the main themes here. But it's a system of understanding human development. And it's clear, at least it seems pretty clear where this is headed, that these are the tools, or these are the insights we can use to understand what tools it's going to take to bring us to recognize godliness, and how we can, how shall I say, I'm intuiting, I'm forecasting. It's going to help us develop our emotions, and how can we be more tuned to the Eibishter, and how can we control our emotions, and even within the spheros. I'm just anticipating this is where it's headed. Like, this is what the Rabbi Rashab does frequently. He gives an example that we can relate to in our world, materiality, or something that's familiar to us, and certainly child development is familiar to most of us. And then he uses that as a springboard to explain much more sophisticated concepts in Elokus, and in the Seder Ishtalshelus, and then the Motza, etc. So that seems like a common framework for explaining the Chassidus. So, and I will add, I think we can agree this is an extremely accurate portrait of child development, of human development, that he's laid out here for the past 2-3 pages. So, in fact, it blows the mind how advanced it is, given that he had no access to modern science, medicine, psychological development, etc. My question is, what is this based on very specific Torah sources or Kabbalistic sources? Because none are given here. On the one hand, and maybe yes, there may be some concepts you mentioned before. That some mochin, whatever, mochin that is intellectual and the emotional, or the emotional in the material. I understand there may be some concepts, some verbiage that are recognized in Kabbalah, but even that may be based on empirical observation. That's just the way the Kabbalists understood or observed human development, and they came up with some verbiage to identify it. It doesn't necessarily mean that knowledge is received Torah wisdom. It's just it's very very bright assessment of observation of human nature. So my question is this all that we've been reading setting up as a framework to help us understand, and in other words, to learn from this, the way the Eibishter created humans, the way we develop, also to understand how the ethereal realm is developed, how the state of Ishtalshelus, we can draw from it, because the way God made us is like we're like Tzelem Elokim. So the way He made us in our development is something about how we would develop the spiritual side. So the question is, are we learning from the human development? Are we going to draw from that and understand that's how the Seder, there's a parallel understanding of the Seder Ishtalshelus from the fact of the nature of human development, and we're going to draw from that? Or is it a mashal, or is it actually what's given here is coming from Torah sources, and then he's going to say, okay, so as it is with the physical human development, so too it is in the spiritual development of a human being. you understand the thrust of the question? I've asked a couple questions, but they're all related here.
Well, it's addressing a fundamental misunderstanding of the whole idea. Let me explain. First of all, the Rebbe Rashab, every word he writes is Torah. The Rambam writes in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, Torah b'perusha nitna. The Torah was given with its explanation and commentary, which includes pshat, remez, drush, sod. So first of all that we're learning here is called Divrei Elikim Chaim. It's Torah. Whether it's an example or it's a moral or it's all part of one large Torah. So just like when you learn the Gemara is oral interpretation that was passed on, and that all originates from what Moshe heard from God at Sinai. So it's another whole discussion, what exactly did God say and what exactly is the interpretation? So overall, everything is Torah. That's number one. Whether the Rebbe Rashab gives a source or not, first of all, he himself is a source because he's a master authority on Torah. So just secondly, the fact that he's using terms, and if you're familiar with the subject, Ibra Unika Moichem Mutva Murgash Muskel, there are many, many pages of this written. So I know the sources myself without even, because I've learned it. So it's just a matter of information. So there's plenty talked about in Eitz Chaim and earlier and so on. Sometimes the Rebbe Rashab cites a source, sometimes he doesn't, but you can rest assured it's all based on given existent sources. The fact is that things say in sources doesn't mean it doesn't make sense also logically. So the idea that this is being taken from trying to find an example from human observation to understand Torah, no, this is Torah. When the Alter Rebbe gave examples from my flesh I behold God, that's part of this, part of the Chassidus, part of Torah. And Chassidus is part of Torah. And when you learn it, you make a bracha, birchas ha-Torah. When you learn Ayin Beis or anything, you're supposed to make a bracha. And you make the same bracha when you learn Chumash, which is God's Torah. How that Torah is presented and the role of teachers and so on, that's another discussion, which is really not for now. As far as the other things you said, look, we're learning the Maimer. I right now am not even thinking about where this is going to lead and how it's going to be used, because I rely that the Rebbe Rashab is going to spell it all out. And I want him to guide me and us. I don't want my mind to guide it. So right now, it's clearly he's developing the whole idea, which he's going to bring back to explain ultimately Gan Eden and so on. And also he said Ba'avodah, what our own Avodah is. So I think this is all part of one thing. The Avodah of Nehi, Chagas, Chabad is very much part of how God created us. And that's what we're discussing now. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question or not, or maybe I'm not, maybe I didn't understand your question. But to me, this is all part of one Torah, and we're learning it in that fashion. And as I said, it'll all become clear as we learn, continue learning where he's going with this.
Yeah. By the way, I wasn't suggesting, God forbid, this isn't Torah, but there is an aspect.
I don't know what you suggest. You asked the question, I answered. That's all. I'm not.
Yeah. Okay.
As I said, maybe I hope I answer your questions. If I didn't, if to then spell out what your questions.
Well, maybe you could give some sources where you see this developed from.
First of all, to me, this is a source. Number one, this is a source. So I don't really, to me, I only look for, so I would look for a source if I didn't understand something. This is a source, just for the record. For me, when I read the Rebbe Rashab saying it, just like if the Arizal says, what's the difference?
Okay, well, I'm not disagreeing with you, God forbid. I please don't, I'm not suggesting.
If there's something that's unclear, then I would go look. I happen to learn this subject already many times. I know where it's discussed in different places. You can go look in Sefer Lekutim of the Tzemach Tzedek. There he usually gathers more information if you want. It's perfectly fine to do research and so on.
That's what I'm asking for.
So there's just look in indexes and look in the encyclopedias on this topic. It's fine to do that,
On what topic? Where would I begin to look?
There's a book called Sefer Likutim. I quote it a number of times. It's a Chassidus encyclopedia, and I worked on, where he brings together all this, in alphabetical order, the different themes. You could do that with any topic, just for the record. He has everything from Aleph to Tav, from A to Z. So one of them is Ibri Unique Moichin, and you'll see more information on this. And I mentioned Tav Shin Gimel. There's a few places, but as I said, I usually will mention other places if we need more explanation. Here, frankly, he's giving more explanation here than I've seen anywhere else. So this is a very solid and very fundamental text, because it really gives the bigger picture here.
Well, I certainly agree with you about what you just said, and
It's not a personal agreement or disagreement. It's I'm just sharing how I understand what we're learning.
It's a very elaborate development of thought. It's very detailed and it's very specific. I'm agreeing with your comment. If I'm allowed to do that, I'm sorry if you want to object to my disagreeing with you. It's unique to be objected to and someone agrees with you, but that's okay.
It's not about you and me agreeing. I'm giving a picture of what's going on here. It's not like we have two different interpretations and we agree or disagree. That's my point. This is I'm just giving you the overview of what's going on when we learn these Maimorim.
I was agreeing with you. This is very explanatory. Look, all I was saying is, if you look at the rest of Ayin Beis, and I haven't been through all of it, but this is a long discussion without almost any sources at all. Okay, I could count maybe one per page, maybe. And if you look at the rest of Ayin Beis, there are maybe one source every couple lines. And in that sense, it strikes someone like me who's less knowledgeable in Chassidus as perhaps a mashal, a very developed mashal. But
no, that's incorrect. That's incorrect completely. It's just the Rebbe Rashab decides where he wants to, where he doesn't want to. There are places in Ayin Beis we already learned 1,224 pages that go pages and pages, and he does not cite sources. And there are pages where he cites 100 sources on a page. And it's really, there's no real rule to this. It all depends. The Rabbeim did it their way. The Alter Rebbe, for example, most of his Maimorim does not have sources. Tzemach Tzedek added sources. There's a lot of different approaches. There's no real, I don't think you can conclude anything from that. I don't, why he does it this way. Some places he wants us to go look it up. He wants to give, he's being brief. Here he's elaborating so much. So, and it's not over yet. There's another 30 pages on this topic. So we'll see, how as he brings in.
Okay, well, since you talk about Ayin Beis, another thing I'll say, sometimes he could bring one source and you could find out from that source that a lot of what he's writing here is actually cited word for word from another mimer. But that doesn't change the fact that, like the Mittler Rebbe, for example, if you read the Mittler Rebbe's Chassidus, he can go hundreds of pages without sources. And yet we all know it's very well sourced, that when you see the publication, when it's published with the sources below, and they're preparing this also that way, you suddenly see that there'll be hundreds of sources on these pages too, just for the record. Why the Rebbe Rashab himself doesn't? Because he didn't write it in a way that he gave a source for everything that he says. I think the main thrust of my question
there is an edition of Ayin Beis. I don't know if you saw it. It hasn't reached this far yet, but there's an edition.
I have it with a lot of footnotes.
Yeah. Those notes were done by others, but those are basically sources. This is very common in Chassidus. It's very common. The Rebbe himself was involved in a lot in that. Yeah.
So I guess
since we're on a different subject, let me just conclude here the recording, and then we can continue here. So I'm stopping here at the bottom of page 1220.